Hi there, I'm Dr. Stephen Phelan. Welcome to this video. Today, we're doing another video questions answered series video, but this one, again, will be in my provisional series. So we've had a lot of questions about provisional restorations during this webinar, so I'm trying to answer them as a series of questions throughout this video series. So this question's from Dr. Duarte, and it was asked a few times by different doctors, but Dr. Duarte is asking, since the wax up of the centrals was modified in the provisional restorations, how did you tell the lab to fabricate the final restorations? And this is a good question, and it really comes down to the restorative records that we would present to the lab to finalize and build your case. And we have an entire presentation about this in Module 6 of Occlusion Design. In fact, I have a couple versions of it. One is where my ceramist, who I do these cases with, Harold Heindel, actually joins the presentation, and we talk about lab perspective, clinician's perspective of the restorative records needed for a case. But what I'll tell you regarding this is typically Harold will do the wax up. We make the wax up idealized as much as it can be based on our decision about where to build the vertical, how to create the tooth form, and where to build the angle of guidance, occlusion, etc. So we're making a very, what I would call, educated guess about designing everything in the wax up, but we can't tell for sure what that's going to be like until we test it in the patient's mouth. So I transfer the wax up to the patient's mouth by making the provisional restorations, and you could use a putty for this, you can use a shell made on something like the BioStar machine, or you could mill them from a PMMA block. So however you transfer the wax up to the provisional, you'll get the provisional in the patient's mouth based on the wax up. The issue is how well does that work in the patient's mouth? Because the wax up is the representation of where you think the case should be, but the real testing is in the patient's mouth, obviously. So there's inevitably, in most of these cases, some adjustments. Some cases we find the incisal edge position maybe should be a little bit longer after the patient's tried it out. Some cases we might shorten the incisal edge position a tiny bit. Some cases it's right, but it's a range, so it's somewhat personal preference, somewhat speech and phonetics, and somewhat just what do we all think it looks like in its best form. Again, personal preference. So what we need to do is test it out. After testing, we adjust it, obviously. Most cases need some adjustment somewhere based on the wax up. So it will not be the exact same, the provisional will not be the exact same thing as the wax up. It's just not likely at all. So what we want to do is, finishing the case, we don't send the wax up and say duplicate that for the final restorations. We send as accurate a model as possible of the provisional restorations. So we make accurate models of the provisional restorations that then Harold uses to create the final restorations. So to do that, we typically will take provisional models, provisional impressions using polyether impression material. Typically we use Impergum. So one of the Impergum soft materials, Permadyne is what I use for final prep impressions, but it's too stiff for provisional impressions. It would probably pull them off. Even Impergum will the soft version of Impergum will even pull off provisionals in some cases. But for the most part, it doesn't. Most of the time, it doesn't. So what we do is we plan it out so that at the restorative records appointment, frequently I want to take off the posterior provisionals anyway. So once we're satisfied with everything with the provisionals, we take a Impergum impression, and then if the posterior provisionals come off, no big deal. I was going to take them off anyway to do the bite records. So that's kind of the sequence that we follow. If the anterior provisionals come off, I have to re-cement them, typically for the bite records. but it's pretty rare that the anteriors will come off. If anything comes off, it's usually the posteriors because they tend to not be as retentive. And so that's not a big deal. So we kind of plan it around doing it that way. You could take an alginate of the provisionals, and for the most part, it's pretty good, but not as good as taking a polyether impression of the provisionals. I've shown that before in some of my webinars. I have a comparison slide between alginate impression, what the stone model looks like on an alginate impression, same case, stone model poured from a polyether impression. We use a bite record to look at the accuracy of each model. There's a big difference with the stone model poured from alginate compared to a polyether impression of the provisionals, a stone model poured from that. So we want as much precision in the final outcome of the case. So I take polyether impressions of the provisionals or the opposing arch that's either not treated or finished porcelain restorations. So this all comes down to precision restorative records. Again, I have an entire presentation on this topic, very detailed, and it's in module 6 of occlusion design. So thanks for joining me on this video. Hopefully it gives you some good ideas. What I'll say is, if you're interested in this topic of these bigger, more rehabilitation type of cases, maybe attend my VDO seminar. It's Altering the Vertical Dimension Case Studies, and you could go to vdoseminar.com. That's vdoseminar.com. Thank you very much. Take care.